My name is Walter Greaves. I am 73 years old, and for the last 12 years I have lived in a small wooden cabin near the eastern edge of the Appalachian Mountains. After my wife Ellen died, I could no longer find reason to remain among the voices of the city. I came here seeking silence, and for a long time, silence was enough. The cabin itself is unremarkable. Weathered pine boards that creak under my weight, a tin roof that drums when it rains, windows that rattle in their frames when the wind comes down from the hills. There's a wood stove in the corner, a narrow bed against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, though only one has been used in over a decade. The second chair sits there like a monument to absence, its seat covered in a thin layer of dust that I never quite bring myself to wipe away. Ellen used to sit there in the mornings, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the light move through the trees. I see her there sometimes, in the corner of my vision, a trick of shadow and longing that disappears when I turn my head. My mornings follow a rhythm worn smooth by repetition. I wake before dawn, always, because sleep has become a shallow thing in old age. The darkness before sunrise is the quietest part of the day, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. I light the stove first, feeding it split logs until the metal begins to tick and expand with heat. Then I fill the iron kettle and set it on the burner, waiting for the water to boil. The sound of it is comforting, a low whistle that rises and falls like breathing. I make my coffee black, strong enough to strip paint. The beans are old, bought in bulk from a store 20 miles down the mountain, and they taste like burnt earth and bitterness. I drink it anyway, standing at the window, looking out at the gray shapes of trees emerging from the darkness. There's a particular quality to the light here, especially in autumn when the leaves turn and fall. It filters through the canopy in shafts, catches on the mist that rises from the ground, turns everything soft and uncertain. I have learned to love this uncertainty, the way the world refuses to show itself all at once. After coffee, I toast bread in the cast iron skillet, turning it with my fingers until both sides are dark and crisp. The bread is always a day or two old, sometimes more, bought on my weekly trips to town. I eat it dry, or with a smear of butter if I remember to keep some. The taste does not matter much anymore. Food is fuel, nothing more. Ellen used to cook meals that filled the house with warmth and smell, roasts and stews and pies that steamed when you cut into them. I never learned to do the same. I eat to survive, mechanical and joyless, and I do not miss what I never had the skill to recreate. After breakfast, I walk. This is the part of the day I treasure most. I follow the same path each morning, down the slope behind the cabin, through a stand of hemlock and oak, to where the land dips into a shallow valley and a creek runs clear over smooth stones. The water is cold even in summer, fed by springs higher up the mountain. In winter, it slows but never quite freezes, moving beneath a skin of ice that cracks and reforms with each change in temperature. I stand there by the bank, listening to the sound of it, the endless patient music of water finding its way downhill. The wind here is constant. It comes down from the ridges, funneling through the valleys, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth, and sometimes, in the right season, the faint sweetness of wildflowers. It makes the trees sway and the cabin groan, a language I have learned to read. A steady wind means clear weather. A shifting wind means a storm is coming. A dead wind, no movement at all, is the rarest and most unsettling, because the mountains are never truly still. I talk to Ellen sometimes, out loud, standing by the creek or sitting on the porch in the evening light. I tell her about small things, the passage of a deer near the cabin, the way the sun struck the rocks this morning, the sound of a crow calling from the ridge. I know she is not there to hear me. I know it is a habit of loneliness, the mind reaching out to fill the empty spaces. But I do it anyway, because the sound of my own voice, even speaking to no one, is better than the alternative. Time moves differently here. In the city, time was measured in hours and appointments, in obligations and schedules. Here, there are no clocks that matter. Time is the arc of the sun across the sky, the color of the light, the temperature of the air. It is the crack of wood settling as the cabin cools at night. It is the distant call of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the creak of the floorboards when I shift my weight in bed. These sounds mark my days more surely than any watch. Evenings, I sit on the porch if the weather allows, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the darkness come up from the valley like a rising tide. The light fades slowly here, filtered through layers of trees and mist, turning the world soft and blue before surrendering to black. I listen to the night sounds, the chorus of insects and frogs, the occasional scream of a fox, the wind moving through the branches overhead. I have learned to identify each sound, to know what belongs and what does not. The woods have their own vocabulary, and I have become fluent in it. I am not unhappy here. That is important to say, before what follows makes you think otherwise. This life, this solitude, was a choice I made deliberately and without regret. I needed distance from the world, from the noise and the crowds and the constant press of other lives against my own. I needed a place where I could hear myself think, where the days could unfold without interruption or demand. And for 12 years, I found exactly that. The cabin was my refuge, the silence my companion, the routine my anchor. But routines, no matter how solid they seem, are fragile things. They depend on the world remaining consistent, predictable, knowable. They depend on the assumption that tomorrow will look like today, that the patterns we observe will hold. And when that assumption breaks, when something enters the frame that does not belong, the whole structure begins to collapse. You do not notice it at first. The changes are small, subtle, easy to dismiss. A sound out of place, a detail that does not quite fit, a feeling, nothing more, that something has shifted in the space around you. I lived 12 years in perfect, predictable solitude. And then, one morning in November, I found footprints by the creek, bare feet, human, and nothing was the same after that. The silence, I learned, is never truly empty. It is only waiting for something to fill it. And once that happens, once the silence is broken, you can never quite get it back. You can only listen and wonder and hope that whatever is out there in the dark is willing to let you be. But hoping, as I would soon discover, does not change what is already coming. It was a morning in early November when I first noticed something wrong. The sky was low and gray, heavy with clouds that pressed down on the valley like a lid. There was no wind, which was unusual for this time of year, and the air had a stillness to it that made every sound seem too loud, too close. I remember the way my boots crunched on the frozen leaves as I walked down to the creek, how the sound echoed off the trees in a way it normally did not. The footprints were there, at the edge of the water, pressed deep into the soft mud of the bank. I stood looking at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They were human, unmistakably so, the clear outline of a heel and 5 toes, the ball of the foot pressed deeper than the arch. But they were bare, no shoes, no socks, nothing. And they were fresh, made recently enough that the edges had not yet begun to blur or collapse. I knelt down to examine them more closely. The feet that made these prints had been large, larger than mine, and heavy. Each print was deep, as though whoever made them had been carrying weight or pressing down hard as they walked. There was something deliberate about the spacing, the way each foot had been placed carefully, one in front of the other, following the edge of the creek upstream toward the deeper woods. The temperature that morning was barely above freezing. The ground was hard in most places, the grass white with frost. To walk barefoot in that cold would have been painful, possibly dangerous. Frostbite sets in quickly when you are exposed like that, especially in water. I tried to imagine what kind of person would do such a thing, walk barefoot through the November woods, and came up with nothing that made sense. A lost hiker, maybe, separated from their gear, someone confused, disoriented, suffering from hypothermia. But those explanations felt thin, inadequate. The prints were too deliberate, too sure. I followed them as far as I could. They led upstream along the rocky bank, sometimes disappearing on patches of stone and then reappearing in the next stretch of mud. I walked slowly, carefully, watching where I put my feet, keeping my eyes on the trail. The trees closed in overhead, bare branches interlocking, and the light took on a dimness that made it hard to judge distance. The footprints continued for maybe 200 yards, and then, without warning, they simply stopped. I stood at the place where they ended, looking around, trying to understand. There was no explanation, No logical reason for the trail to end so abruptly. The ground was soft there, the same mud that had captured every other print in perfect detail. But after a certain point, there was nothing. No more tracks, no sign of where the person had gone. It was as though they had been lifted into the air, or as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. I searched the surrounding area, moving in widening circles, looking for any continuation of the trail. I found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no indication that anyone had passed through. Just the empty woods, silent and still, and a growing sense of unease that I could not shake. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that I was missing something obvious, that the person had simply stepped onto a rock or a log and the trail had continued, somewhere I had not yet looked. But I did not believe it, even as I thought it. I went back to the cabin feeling unsettled in a way I could not quite name. I stood at the window for a long time that afternoon, looking out at the trees, watching the light fade. The clouds never broke, and the day died into evening without ever truly brightening. I made dinner, ate without tasting, washed my plate and cup and set them to dry. And then, as the darkness settled fully over the valley, I heard the footsteps. They came from outside, somewhere close to the cabin, a slow and steady rhythm of steps on the frozen ground, not the uncertain shuffle of an animal, not the quick light patter of a deer or the heavy crash of a bear. These were human footsteps, measured and deliberate, the sound of boots or bare feet pressing down and lifting, moving around the perimeter of the cabin in a wide circle. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hand still on the counter, listening. The steps moved from the front of the cabin to the side, then around toward the back. They paused near the window, and I heard a sound like breathing, low and ragged, close enough that I could almost feel it through the glass. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but the words caught in my throat. After a long moment, the steps resumed. They moved away from the window, continued around the back of the cabin, and then stopped altogether. I waited, counting my own heartbeats, but there was nothing more. Just the silence, pressing in from all sides, heavier than before. I forced myself to move. I went to the front door, unlocked it, stepped out onto the porch. The air was brutally cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. The night was black, no moon, no stars, the clouds still thick overhead. I held the lantern high, casting a weak circle of light that barely reached the edge of the clearing. I called out, my voice sounding strange and small in the emptiness. Nothing answered. No movement, no sound, no response at all. I walked slowly around the cabin, following the path the footsteps had taken, holding the lantern low to examine the ground. But the earth was too hard to hold prints, and I found nothing, no trace of whoever or whatever had been there, only the memory of the sound and the cold fact of my own fear. Over the next few nights it happened again. The footsteps would come after dark, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, lingering in places where I could not see. Sometimes they were accompanied by other sounds, a low scraping against the wood, a tapping on the glass, a whisper of movement just beyond the reach of the light. I began to dread the evenings, the moment when the sun dropped below the ridge, and the darkness came spilling down into the valley like water into a bowl. And then came the voices. They started as faint sounds, distant and indistinct, woven into the background noise of wind and trees. At first, I thought they were natural, the calls of night birds or the cry of some animal I did not recognize. But as I listened more carefully, I began to hear patterns, rhythms, something that sounded almost like speech. One night, standing at the window, I heard it clearly. A voice, thin and wavering, calling my name, not shouting, not urgent, just a quiet repetition over and over. Walter, Walter, Walter. The sound of it made my skin crawl because it was Ellen's voice, or something very much like it. The same tone, the same inflection, the way she used to call me from another room when she needed something. But Ellen was dead, had been dead for 12 years, and whatever was out there in the dark was not her. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief and solitude were playing tricks on me, that the isolation had finally begun to crack something in my mind. But I knew, even as I thought it, that it was not true. The sounds were real. The footprints had been real. Something was out there, circling the cabin, watching, waiting, calling to me in a voice that knew my name. I set up the old tape recorder, the one I used to use for dictating notes when I taught at the university. I left it running through the night, placed on the table near the window, recording everything. I needed proof, needed to know that what I was hearing was not just the invention of a lonely old man losing his grip on reality. In the morning, I rewound the tape and pressed play. For a long time, there was nothing but the ambient sound of wind, the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the distant hoot of an owl. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. A whisper, low and clear, speaking directly into the microphone. "You are not alone." I played it back again and again, listening until the words lost their meaning and became only sounds. But they were there, undeniable, a voice recorded in the empty cabin in the middle of the night while I slept. And beneath the voice, if I listened carefully, I could hear footsteps, the same slow, deliberate rhythm I had heard outside the window. Something was here, in these woods, in this place I had thought was mine alone, and it knew I was here. It knew my name. And it was not leaving. I spent the following morning going over the recording again and again, sitting at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, listening to that whispered phrase loop through the speakers. "You are not alone." 3 words, spoken by a voice I did not recognize, captured in the silence of my cabin while I slept. The rational part of my mind searched desperately for explanations. Radio interference, perhaps, some stray signal picked up by the old tape recorder. An echo from somewhere else, carried on the wind and captured by accident, even my own voice, sleep-talking, distorted by the recording until it sounded unfamiliar. But none of these explanations held up to scrutiny. The voice was not mine. It was too low, too rough, and it spoke with a certainty that sent ice through my veins. Worse than the words themselves was what I heard beneath them when I turned up the volume and listened with my ear pressed close to the speaker. Footsteps. The same measured, deliberate footsteps I had heard circling the cabin. They were faint, muffled by the walls in the distance, but they were there, moving in the background of the recording like a heartbeat. I needed to see what was happening outside while I slept, needed some kind of physical evidence beyond just sound. So I forced myself to go out, to search the perimeter of the cabin in the cold morning light. The ground was harder now, frozen solid in places where the sun never reached, but there were still soft patches, areas where the earth held moisture and would take an impression. I found them near the back corner of the cabin, where the land sloped down toward the tree line. Broken branches snapped clean off at about chest height, the white wood inside still fresh and damp. Below them, more footprints, the same bare feet I had seen by the creek, pressed into a patch of mud that had not yet frozen. These prints were closer to the cabin than the others had been, close enough that whoever made them would have been standing directly beneath my bedroom window. I felt a sick twist in my stomach as I traced the outline of the prints with my eyes. They were real, undeniably real. Not hallucination, not imagination, but physical evidence that someone had been here, standing in my space, violating the boundaries of what I had thought was my sanctuary. I looked up at the window, imagining a figure standing there, looking in at me as I slept, and the thought made me shudder. But it was what I found next that truly frightened me. Scattered around the cabin, in no pattern I could immediately discern, were small piles of stones. Each pile contained maybe a dozen rocks, stacked carefully, deliberately, the larger ones on the bottom and the smaller ones balanced on top. They formed rough circles around the cabin, maybe 20 or 30 feet out, marking the boundary of some invisible perimeter. I had not put them there. I knew that with absolute certainty. I would have remembered doing something like that, and besides, I had no reason to stack stones in the woods around my home, which meant someone else had done it, someone who had been here recently, maybe even last night while I slept. The stones were cold when I touched them, but not wet, which meant they had been placed after the last rain, within the last few days at most. I walked the full circle, counting the piles, 12 of them, evenly spaced, forming a ring that encompassed the cabin entirely. It felt ritualistic, intentional, like some kind of marker or boundary. But a boundary for what? To keep something in Or to keep something out? I had no idea. The not knowing was worse than any explanation could have been. I gathered a few of the stones and brought them inside, setting them on the table next to the tape recorder. They were just ordinary river rocks, smooth and rounded by water, nothing special about them except the way they had been arranged. I photographed the piles outside before I disturbed them further, using an old camera I kept for documenting repairs to the cabin. The film would need to be developed in town, but at least I would have some record of what I had found. That afternoon, I made the drive down the mountain into the nearest town, a small place called Moorfield with one main street and a handful of shops. I went to see Ray Hutchins, an old friend from my teaching days who had retired to become a deputy sheriff. Ray was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, and I thought if anyone would take my concerns seriously, it would be him. I brought the tape recorder and played him the section with the whispered voice. Ray listened with his arms crossed, his face neutral, not saying anything until the recording ended. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and skepticism. He told me it sounded like an owl. Some species of owl, he said, could make sounds that mimicked human speech when filtered through the right kind of interference. He had heard similar things himself, out in the woods, sounds that could trick your ear if you were not expecting them. And the footsteps, he suggested, could have been any number of things, deer, maybe, or a bear moving through the underbrush. Sounds carry strangely in the mountains, he said, especially at night when everything is quiet. What you think is right outside your window might actually be 100 yards away. I wanted to argue with him, to tell him that I knew the difference between an animal and a person, that I had lived in those woods for 12 years and knew every sound they made. But looking at his face, at the patient condescension in his eyes, I realized it would be pointless. He had already decided that I was a lonely old man hearing things, and nothing I said would change that. He walked me to the door with a hand on my shoulder, told me to come back into town more often, said that isolation could play tricks on the mind. Maybe I should think about getting a phone installed, he suggested, or at least a radio, something to keep me connected to the world. His kindness was genuine, but it stung more than outright dismissal would have. He was treating me like someone fragile, someone who needed to be humored and managed. I drove back up the mountain feeling more alone than I had in years. The recording sat on the seat beside me, proof that something was happening, and yet it had convinced no one. I thought about the stones circling my cabin, about the footprints in the mud, about the voice calling my name in the darkness. Real, all of it, tangible and present, but invisible to everyone except me. That night, I dreamed. It was a vivid dream, more real than most, the kind that feels like memory when you wake. In the dream, I was lying in bed, exactly where I was sleeping in reality, and I became aware of a presence in the cabin. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling, a certainty that I was not alone. I tried to move, to sit up and look, but my body would not respond. Sleep paralysis, I thought, that strange state where the mind wakes but the body remains locked in sleep. In the dream, I forced my eyes open. The room was dark except for a faint wash of moonlight through the window, and there, in the corner near the door, I saw a figure, just sitting, perfectly still, watching me. I could not make out any features, only a dark shape, human-sized, motionless. The terror I felt was absolute, primal, the kind of fear that erases thought and leaves only the animal instinct to flee. But I could not move, could not scream, could only lie there and stare at the watching figure. When I woke, truly woke, the first light of dawn was breaking through the window. My heart was racing, my body soaked with sweat. I sat up slowly, looking toward the corner where the figure had been. Nothing there, of course, just the same empty space, the same familiar room. A dream, nothing more. Except the blanket at the foot of my bed was folded. Folded neatly, precisely, the corners aligned and the edges smooth. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I had not folded that blanket. I never folded blankets, not since Ellen died. She had been the one who kept things tidy, who made the bed each morning and folded the laundry with military precision. I had let all of that go, living in comfortable disorder, and I certainly had not folded a blanket in the middle of the night. I reached out and touched it, running my fingers over the crisp edges. Real. Not a hallucination, not a trick of the light. Someone had been in my cabin while I slept, standing over my bed, folding my blanket, and I had slept through it all, helpless and unaware. I got up on shaking legs and searched the cabin, looking for any other sign of disturbance. Everything else seemed normal, untouched. Just the blanket, folded with care, a message I could not decipher. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, walking the perimeter again, looking for footprints. I found them, the same bare feet pressed into the frost near the front door. They led up to the porch, stopped at the door, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the tree line. Whatever was here, it had been inside. It had stood over me while I slept, close enough to touch, and I had been powerless to stop it. The cabin, my refuge, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. The boundary had been crossed, and I did not know how to take it back. The nights that followed became a descent into something I can only describe as waking nightmare. Sleep, when it came at all, was thin and fractured, broken by every sound, every shift in the darkness. I would lie in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cabin settle around me, waiting for the footsteps to begin. And they always did, with a regularity that felt almost scheduled, as though whatever was out there knew exactly when the fear would be at its peak. The sounds grew bolder. They no longer stayed at a distance, circling the perimeter. Now they came right up to the walls, pressed against the wood, so close I could hear the grain creak under the pressure. There would be soft tapping, rhythmic and patient, moving along the exterior as though testing for weakness, searching for a way in. Sometimes the tapping would be on the door, light as a knock, 3 beats and then silence, 3 beats and then silence, over and over, until I thought I would lose my mind from the repetition alone. I began locking everything. The front door, the back door, the windows, even though most of them had not been opened in years. I pushed furniture against the entrances, the old dresser against the back door, a chair wedged under the handle of the front. It was irrational, I knew, the actions of someone succumbing to paranoia, but I could not stop myself. The need to create barriers, to make the cabin impenetrable, was overwhelming. And yet, every morning when I woke, I would find something out of place. A chair moved from where I had left it, dragged several feet across the floor, the legs leaving scratches in the wood. The back door slightly ajar, just an inch or two, letting in a wedge of cold air that I would not notice until I walked past and felt the draft on my skin. And the footprints, always the footprints, tracked across the floor in damp impressions that led from the door to various points around the cabin and then back out again. I could not explain it. The doors had been locked, I was certain of that, had checked them multiple times before going to bed. And yet something was getting in, moving through my space while I slept, leaving traces of its presence like a signature. The wet footprints were the worst because they meant the thing had been outside in the cold and damp, had walked through mud or shallow water, and then had somehow entered my home and crossed my floor while I lay unconscious and vulnerable just feet away. I tried to stay awake to catch whatever it was in the act. I would sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, the shotgun across my lap, watching the door by lamplight. But exhaustion always won. My eyes would grow heavy, my head would nod, and I would wake hours later to find the lamp had burned down, the coffee gone cold, and something new disturbed. A window unlatched, a book moved from the shelf to the table. Once, disturbingly, my own jacket hung on a different hook than where I had left it, turned inside out. I began to doubt my own memory, to wonder if I was doing these things myself, and forgetting. Sleepwalking, perhaps, or some early symptom of dementia, my mind unraveling after years of isolation. The thought terrified me more than the alternative, because it meant the threat was not external, but internal, that I was losing myself from the inside out, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Desperate for answers, for validation that I was not simply going mad, I took the recording back to town. Not to Ray this time, but to a young man named Marcus who ran a small electronics repair shop on the edge of Moorfield. Marcus had a reputation for being good with technology, and more importantly, he had no preconceptions about me, no history that would color his interpretation of what he heard. I played him the tape, the section with the whispered voice and the background footsteps. Marcus listened with headphones, his eyes closed, his face concentrated. When the recording ended, he opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. He told me there were definitely human vocal frequencies layered over the ambient noise. Not just one voice, he said, but multiple, overlapping, some of them so faint they were barely detectable even with the headphones. He offered to clean up the audio, to isolate the different frequency ranges, and see if he could make out what was being said. I left the tape with him, feeling a small spark of hope. Finally, someone who was not dismissing me, who was willing to look deeper. Marcus promised to call me when he had something, said it would take a few days to process the audio properly. I thanked him and drove back up the mountain, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. But when I returned 3 days later to pick up the tape, Marcus's expression had changed. He looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic. He handed me the recorder and told me the files were corrupted. All of them, he said, not just the section I had played for him, but the entire tape. He had tried multiple times to recover the audio, had used different software, different equipment, but every time he tried to open the files, they would freeze and crash. Eventually, the tape itself had degraded to the point where it would no longer play at all, just made a grinding sound when he tried to load it. I took the recorder from him, feeling the weight of it in my hands, and asked if he had backed up the files before they corrupted. He shook his head. He had tried, he said, but the backup had failed too, and now there was nothing left. Just blank tape, erased as though it had never held anything at all. I could see in his eyes that he did not believe it was a technical failure, that something about the whole situation had unsettled him. But he did not say that, just handed me the recorder and told me he was sorry he could not help. I drove back to the cabin in a daze. The only evidence I had, the one thing that might have proven I was not imagining all of this, was gone, erased, destroyed. And I was back where I had started, alone with my fear and no way to make anyone else understand what was happening. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and began to write. I took out an old notebook, the kind with lined pages and a leather cover, and I started documenting everything. Every sound I heard, every footprint I found, every object that moved or appeared where it should not be. I wrote down dates and times, drew diagrams of where the stone circles had been, described the quality of the whispered voice on the recording. I wrote as though my sanity depended on it, as though the act of putting words on paper would somehow make it all more real, more manageable. But as I wrote, something strange began to happen. My handwriting, normally steady and controlled, started to shake. The letters became irregular, uneven, as though my hand were being guided by something other than my own intention. I would write a sentence and then look at it and barely recognize it as my own. The words were mine, the thoughts were mine, but the execution felt foreign, as though someone else were holding the pen alongside me, pressing down with their own force. I stopped writing and stared at my hand, flexing my fingers, trying to understand what was happening. Fatigue, I told myself. Stress. Too many sleepless nights and too much fear. But I knew it was more than that. I could feel it, a presence in the room with me, invisible but undeniable, watching as I tried to document what was being done to me. The voices came more frequently now, and they were no longer just at night. I would hear them in the middle of the day, faint whispers carried on the wind, speaking words I could almost but not quite understand. Sometimes they overlapped, multiple voices speaking at once, creating a chorus of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And sometimes, horribly, I heard my own name spoken in Ellen's voice, that same gentle tone she had used when she was alive, calling to me as though she were just in the next room waiting for me to come to her. I knew it was not Ellen. I knew that with absolute certainty. Ellen was dead, buried in a cemetery 200 miles away, and whatever was using her voice was something else entirely, something that had learned how to mimic the sound of love and familiarity to get close to me. But knowing that did not make it any easier to hear. Each time I heard her voice, my heart would break a little more, torn between the desperate hope that somehow she had come back and the terrible knowledge that she had not. I began to lose track of time. The days blurred together, marked only by the cycle of light and dark, and even that became unreliable. I would look at the clock and see that hours had passed when I thought it had been only minutes, or I would sit down for what felt like a moment and realized the sun had set, and the cabin was dark, and I had lost an entire afternoon to some fugue state I could not remember entering. The isolation that had once been my refuge had become my prison. The silence that had once brought me peace now only amplified every sound, every whisper, every hint of presence that was not my own. I was trapped in this cabin, in these woods, with something that knew me, that watched me, that moved through my space with impunity. And I could not leave because where would I go? Who would believe me? What safety could I find that this thing could not reach? I thought about Ellen, about the years we had together, about the life I had left behind when I came to these mountains. Had I made a mistake? Had I traded one kind of emptiness for another, given up human connection for a solitude that had now turned predatory? I did not know anymore. All I knew was that something had found me here, in this place I thought was hidden, and it was not letting go. The storm came on a night in late November, rolling down from the high peaks with a violence I had not seen in all my years on the mountain. The sky had been darkening all day, heavy clouds building and churning, the air thick with the smell of rain and ozone. By evening, the wind had picked up, bending the trees nearly horizontal, tearing leaves from branches and sending them spiraling into the gathering darkness. I stood at the window watching it come, feeling something like resignation settle over me. The storm felt appropriate somehow, a physical manifestation of everything that had been building inside and around me for weeks. When the rain started, it came all at once, not the gentle increase of a normal storm, but a sudden deluge that hammered against the roof like fists. The sound was deafening, drowning out everything else, turning the world beyond the windows into a gray blur. Lightning flickered, brief and brilliant, illuminating the trees in stark white relief before plunging everything back into darkness. Thunder followed, so close and loud that it shook the walls, rattled the glass, made the floorboards vibrate under my feet. I lit the lantern and set it on the kitchen table, checking the windows to make sure they were secure. The wind was finding every crack and gap in the cabin's construction, whistling through places I had not known existed, creating a symphony of eerie sounds that mixed with the roar of the rain. I tried to tell myself it was just weather, just a storm, that I had weathered dozens like it before. But I could not shake the feeling that this was different, that something was using the storm as cover, waiting in the chaos for its moment. The power, such as it was, went out within the first hour. The single bulb that hung from the kitchen ceiling flickered twice and died, leaving only the warm glow of the lantern to push back the darkness. I sat at the table with the shotgun within reach, listening to the storm rage around me, trying to distinguish between the sounds of wind and rain and the sounds of something else, something moving with purpose through the tempest. And then I heard it, beneath the thunder and the wind, a sound that did not belong. A scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the front of the cabin. Metal on wood, the sound of something being dragged or pushed, patient and persistent. I stood slowly, picking up the shotgun, checking that it was loaded even though I had already checked twice before. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of terrible anticipation, the knowledge that whatever had been circling me for weeks was finally coming. I moved toward the front door, the lantern held high in my left hand, the gun in my right. The scraping continued, and now I could hear something else beneath it, a low sound that might have been breathing or might have been the wind forcing its way through some gap I could not see. The door was still locked, the deadbolt engaged, the chair still wedged under the handle. But as I watched, the handle began to move. It turned slowly, testing the resistance, finding the lock in the chair, and pushing against them with steady pressure. I raised the gun, aimed it at the door, my finger on the trigger, waiting. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to call out, to warn whoever was there, to at least confirm that it was a human being before I considered shooting. But my voice would not come. I stood frozen, watching the handle turn and turn again, knowing that no one should be out in this storm, that no one rational would be trying to force their way into my home. The handle stopped moving. For a long moment there was only the sound of the rain, the wind, the hammering of my own heart. And then came the scratching. Long, slow drags down the length of the door, the sound of fingernails or something like fingernails raking the wood. Not random, not frantic, but methodical, as though whatever was out there was marking the door, claiming it, making a statement I could not understand. I wanted to look, to open the door, and face whatever was there, but I could not make my body move. Some primal instinct held me rooted to the floor, kept the gun raised, kept my eyes fixed on the door as the scratching continued. And beneath it, unmistakable now, I heard a voice, the same whisper from the recording, low and rough, speaking the same words that had haunted me for weeks. "You are not alone." The voice did not come from beyond the door. It came from inside the cabin, from somewhere behind me, close enough that I could feel the words on the back of my neck like breath. I spun around, sweeping the lantern in a wide arc, illuminating the empty kitchen, the dark corners, the shadowed space beyond. Nothing there. No one. Just the familiar interior of my cabin, rendered strange and threatening by the flickering light and my own terror. I backed toward the bedroom, keeping the gun raised, my eyes scanning every shadow. The voice came again, not from one direction, but from everywhere, surrounding me, layered and multiple, as though a dozen mouths were speaking in unison. My name, over and over, spoken in tones that ranged from Ellen's gentle call to something harsh and inhuman. I reached the bedroom and slammed the door, locking it, shoving the small dresser against it with strength I did not know I still had. The lantern sat on the bedside table, casting long shadows up the walls, making everything move and breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, the gun across my lap, and tried to think, tried to find some explanation that made sense. But there was none. The voice had been inside. Inside the locked cabin, in the room with me, and I had seen nothing. The storm raged on, and with it came the sounds from beyond the bedroom door. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the cabin, the creak of floorboards, the scrape of furniture being moved, the soft thud of something being set down and picked up again. I heard the kitchen chair drag across the floor, heard the cabinet doors open and close, heard the sound of water running, though I knew the pipes should have been frozen. I pressed my ear to the door, listening, trying to understand what was happening in my own home. And then came the murmuring, low voices speaking in a rhythm that sounded like conversation, like multiple people moving through my space, occupying it, making it theirs. I wanted to scream, to burst through the door and confront them, but I could not move. I was paralyzed by fear and the growing certainty that whatever was out there was not something I could fight, not something I could reason with or escape from. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost all meaning, stretched and compressed by fear and exhaustion. The sounds continued, a domestic symphony of occupation, as though a family had moved into my cabin and was going about their evening routine. At some point, I must have dozed, exhaustion overwhelming even terror, because I woke with a start to find the storm had quieted, and the first gray light of dawn was showing through the window. The cabin was silent. I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff and aching, and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no sound at all except the steady drip of water from the eaves. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved the dresser away from the door, unlocked it, opened it slowly, the gun raised and ready. The cabin was empty, but it was not as I had left it. The furniture had been rearranged, chairs moved to different positions, the table turned at an angle. The front door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze, the chair that had been wedged under the handle now sitting neatly at the table. And across the floor, leading from the door to the bedroom and back again, were footprints. Wet, distinct, pressed into the wood with clarity that made my stomach turn. I followed them, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The prints led from outside, through the cabin, right up to the bedroom door where I had locked myself in. They stopped there, a set of them, facing the door as though whoever made them had stood listening while I cowered on the other side. And then they returned, retracing their path, going back through the cabin and out the open door. But there were two sets of prints, one going in, one coming out, and the second set, the ones going out, were mine. I recognized them, the specific tread of my boots, the uneven pressure on the right foot from an old injury. My footprints, leading from the bedroom out into the storm, and then returning. As though I had been the one walking, had been the one outside in the tempest, had been the one coming back in. I stood staring at them, unable to speak, unable to think. Had I sleepwalked? Had I gone outside, without knowing, without remembering, and come back in leaving these tracks? But I was wearing the same clothes I had gone to bed in, and they were dry. My boots were still by the door where I had left them, still dry, still laced. The footprints on the floor were fresh, wet, recent, and I had not made them. I knew that with absolute certainty, even as the evidence before me insisted otherwise. I walked outside into the cold morning air and looked around. The ground was soaked, the storm had turned everything to mud, and there in the soft earth were more prints, dozens of them covering the area around the cabin, overlapping and crossing, some bare and some booted, making patterns I could not decipher. I found my own prints among them, the distinctive tread leading away from the cabin toward the tree line and then stopping, as though I had walked to that point and then vanished. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared into the woods, lost among the roots and rocks. When I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the door, scratched deep into the wood, were words, not carved with a tool, but scraped in by something sharp and patient, the letters uneven but readable. Not alone. The same words from the whisper, from the recording, now made permanent on the wood of my door. A message, a claim, a truth I could no longer deny. I was not alone in these woods, had never been alone, and whatever shared this space with me had made certain I would know it. It has been 2 weeks since the storm, 2 weeks since I scratched those words into my door, or since something using my hand scratched them there. I no longer know which version is true, and I have come to accept that perhaps the distinction does not matter. The truth, I have learned, is not something you prove or disprove. It is something that lives inside you, growing like a seed, reshaping everything you thought you understood about the world and yourself. I have tried to reach out. I drove into town twice, went to the post office, the general store, places where people gather and talk, but no one will engage with me anymore. They see me coming and find reasons to be elsewhere, conversations that suddenly need attending to, errands that cannot wait. Ray Hutchins crossed the street when he saw me, pretended not to notice, disappeared into the hardware store, though I know he had no business there. I am being erased from the community, one averted glance at a time, and I cannot blame them. I see myself in windows and mirrors sometimes, the wild eyes, the unkempt beard, the way my hands shake even when I am trying to hold them still. I look like what I have become, a man untethered from consensus reality, adrift in something that has no name. The sounds continue, but they have changed. They are no longer threatening, no longer invasive. Now they feel like invitations, gentle beckoning from beyond the walls, voices that whisper my name with something almost like affection. The footsteps circle the cabin each night, a rhythm I have learned to find comforting rather than frightening. I know they are there. They know I am here. And we exist in this strange equilibrium, sharing the space, acknowledging each other's presence without confrontation. I have stopped trying to lock the doors. There is no point. Whatever comes and goes does so regardless of locks or barriers, moves through the physical world with a fluidity that makes such precautions meaningless. I leave the door unlatched now, sometimes even open, and I sleep better for it. The pretense of security was exhausting, a constant effort to maintain boundaries that could not hold. Acceptance, I have found, is less tiring than resistance. Last night I went outside and stood in the clearing under a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible that anything could be wrong in a universe capable of such beauty. I stood there for hours, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the cold seep through my clothes, and I spoke to whatever shares this place with me. I told it I was not afraid anymore. I told it I understood, or was trying to understand, that loneliness has many forms and that perhaps I was never the only one seeking refuge in these mountains. The voices answered, not in words I could understand, but in tones that carried meaning nonetheless. Acknowledgement, maybe, or agreement, or simply the recognition that I had finally stopped fighting and started listening. I felt something then, standing in that cold darkness under those infinite stars, something I had not felt since Ellen died. Connection. Not to a person, not to anything I could name or touch, but to the vast, incomprehensible whole of existence, the parts of it that move unseen and speak in whispers and leave footprints that defy explanation. I think now about the 12 years I spent here believing I was alone, how I treasured that solitude, how I protected it, how I used it as a shield against the pain of Ellen's absence. But the truth, the one I am only now beginning to accept, is that I was never alone. Not in the way I thought I was. The woods were always full of presence, of intelligences I could not recognize because I was looking for the wrong things. I was listening for human voices, watching for human shapes, and so I missed everything else that was speaking and moving and existing alongside me. The footprints that appeared by the creek that November morning were not the beginning of something. They were the moment when I finally noticed something that had always been there, the moment when the veil between my perception and the truth wore thin enough for me to see through. And once you see through that veil, once you know that the world is stranger and more populated than you ever imagined, you cannot unsee it. You cannot go back to the comfortable certainty of the life you had before. The question I keep returning to, the one that haunts me more than any voice or footprint or scratching at the door, is this. Did I walk outside during the storm? Did I stand in the rain and the wind and the thunder and do things I cannot remember, move through my own home like a stranger, leave messages for myself in handwriting I do not recognize? Or was it something else, something that took my form, wore my shape, moved through the world in a body that looked like mine but was piloted by a consciousness I cannot fathom? I do not know, and I am learning to be at peace with not knowing. The need for certainty, for concrete answers, for a reality that can be pinned down and examined and understood, is a burden I no longer wish to carry. There are things in this world, in these mountains, in the spaces between sleep and waking, that refuse to be categorized or explained. They exist in the margins, in the gaps, in the moments when you are not quite sure if what you are experiencing is real or imagined, and maybe that is where they are, meant to exist, in that liminal space where all truths become equally valid and equally suspect. Solitude, I have learned, has a price. When you remove yourself from the constant noise and presence of other people, when you strip away all the distractions and the obligations and the endless chatter that fills human life, you are left with something raw and unfiltered. You are left with yourself, yes, but also with everything else that occupies the empty spaces. The silence you seek is never truly silent. It is full, teeming, alive with things that most people never hear because they are too busy making their own noise. And once you start hearing those things, once you tune your perception to that frequency, the silence begins to speak. It whispers your name. It leaves signs for you to find. It moves through your space with the familiarity of an old friend or the menace of an intruder. And you can never quite tell which it is because those categories, friend and threat, no longer apply in the way they once did. I think about Ellen often these days, more than I have in years, not with the sharp grief that brought me to these mountains, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. I wonder what she would make of all this, whether she would believe me or think I had finally lost the thread of sanity. I imagine her sitting in the second chair at the table, the one covered in dust, listening to me explain about the footprints and the voices and the feeling of being watched. I imagine her placing her hand over mine, warm and solid, and telling me in that gentle voice that it is time to come back, that I have been away too long. But I cannot come back. There is no back to return to. The world I left when I came to these mountains does not exist anymore, and even if it did, I have changed too much to fit into it. I have seen too much, heard too much, felt too much. I have crossed into some other territory, and there is no map to guide me home, because home is no longer a place I can locate on any map. The people in town have decided I am crazy, and perhaps they are right. Perhaps all of this, every footprint and whisper and scratched message, is the product of a mind that has been alone too long, that has stared into the silence until the silence stared back, and the distinction between inner and outer, between self and other, dissolved completely. Perhaps I am sleepwalking through my days, creating my own haunting, writing my own mystery in handwriting I can no longer recognize as my own. But the thing about madness, the thing nobody tells you, is that it feels exactly like enlightenment from the inside. It feels like seeing clearly for the first time, like understanding something fundamental that everyone else is too blind or too distracted to perceive. The line between vision and delusion is drawn by other people, by consensus, by the agreement of the majority about what constitutes real. And when you step outside that consensus, when you refuse to agree, or when you simply cannot agree anymore, you become something else, something undefined, something that makes people cross the street to avoid you. I am not afraid anymore. That is the truth I keep coming back to, the one solid thing in a world that has become fluid and uncertain. I am not afraid of the footsteps or the voices or the presence that shares this cabin with me. I'm not afraid of my own footprints appearing where I know I did not walk, or of waking to find things moved and rearranged, or of the words scratched into my door that may or may not have been scratched by my own hands. What I am afraid of is this, that I will wake up one day and the sounds will be gone, that the footsteps will stop circling, the voices will fade, and I will be left truly alone in a silence that is empty rather than full. That the presence, whatever it is, will move on to haunt some other solitary soul in some other forgotten corner of the world, and I will be left with nothing but the memory of having been noticed, having been seen, having mattered to something. Because that is what all of this has been, I think. Not a haunting, but a recognition. Not a threat, but an acknowledgement. Something in these woods saw me, saw my isolation and my grief and my desperate need to be away from everything. And it responded. It reached out in the only way it knew how, with footprints and whispers and presences that refused to announce themselves clearly. It moved through my space not to terrify me, but to remind me that I was not alone, that even in the deepest solitude, there are others. Always others, seen and unseen, known and unknowable. The truth, I have come to understand, is not something you hear. It is something you feel, something that resonates in the spaces between your thoughts, in the moments when you are suspended between sleeping and waking, between believing and doubting. The truth is a frequency that most people tune out, a signal that gets lost in the noise of ordinary life. But here, in this cabin, in these woods, in this silence that is not silent, the truth is all there is. And the truth is this: we are never alone. Not really. Not in the way we think we are. The world is full of presences, of intelligences, of consciousnesses that move through reality on vectors we cannot perceive with ordinary senses. They are there in the footprints that appear and disappear, in the voices that speak our names when no one is present, in the feeling of being watched that we dismiss as paranoia. They are there, and they have always been there, and they will continue to be there long after we are gone. I'm recording this now, writing it down in the same notebook where I tried to document my evidence, where my handwriting shook and changed and became something other than itself. I am writing it as a kind of testament, a message in a bottle cast into a sea of time, hoping that someday someone will find it and understand. Understand what? I am not entirely sure. Understand that the world is stranger than we pretend, that solitude is never complete, that the silence speaks if you listen long enough. Or perhaps I am writing it simply to have something to do, to feel the pen move across the paper, to see words appear and know that I am still here, still functioning, still capable of translating thought into language, even as the boundary between my thoughts and someone else's thoughts becomes increasingly porous. The sun is setting now. I can see it through the window, that long golden light that comes before darkness, and I know the sounds will begin soon. The footsteps, the whispers, the movement through my space that I have learned to welcome rather than fear. I will sit here at this table, in this cabin, in these mountains, and I will listen. And maybe, if I listen carefully enough, I will finally understand what is being said, what has always been said, what will continue to be said, long after my own voice falls silent. The truth is a sound that no one wants to hear. But I'm listening now. I'm finally, truly listening. And in the listening, I have found something I did not expect. Not answers, but peace. Not certainty, but acceptance. Not an end, but a kind of beginning. The footsteps are starting now. I can hear them, soft and sure, circling the cabin as they do every night, and I am not afraid. I am ready. Ready to listen, ready to understand, ready to step through whatever door is opening before me, because in the end, that is all any of us can do. Listen to the silence. Follow the footprints. Trust that the voices speaking our names in the darkness mean us no harm, or mean us exactly the harm we need to finally wake up and see what has always been there, waiting. I am going outside now. The stars are beginning to appear, and the voices are calling. And I think finally I understand what they have been trying to tell me all along. We are not alone. We have never been alone. And that perhaps is the most terrifying and the most beautiful truth there is.